Dutch van der Linde is one of the most complex and fascinating antagonists in video game history, though calling him simply an antagonist doesn't quite capture what he represents. He's a father figure, a philosopher, a revolutionary, a con man, a visionary, and a narcissist, all rolled into one charismatic package. His story spans decades and 2 games, showing his transformation from idealistic outlaw leader to paranoid tyrant, to broken old man still clinging to his delusions. Understanding Dutch means understanding the entire Red Dead Redemption saga, because he's the catalyst for everything that happens, the sun around which all other characters orbit, the dream that everyone follows until it becomes a nightmare. This is the complete story of Dutch van der Linde, from his origins through his ultimate fate, examining how a man with genuine ideals and real love for his people could descend into the monster he becomes. Dutch van der Linde was born in 1855, making him 44 years old during the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 in 1899. His early life remains somewhat mysterious, with details scattered across dialogue and conversations throughout both games. What we know is that Dutch's father fought in the Civil War and died during it, though on which side is never specified. His mother died at some later point. The circumstances unclear, but the loss clearly affecting Dutch deeply. These early experiences with death and loss shaped Dutch's worldview, particularly his distrust of governments and institutions that send men to die for abstract causes, while the powerful remain safe and profit from conflict. Dutch educated himself extensively, reading philosophy, literature and political theory, developing the intellectual framework that would define his approach to outlawry and leadership. Sometime in the 1870s, Dutch met Hosea Matthews, and this partnership would define the next quarter-century of both men's lives. Hosea was older, already an experienced conman and thief, but where Hosea saw crime as a practical means of survival, Dutch saw potential for something greater. The 2 men complemented each other perfectly. Dutch provided vision and ambition, while Hosea provided pragmatism and restraint. Dutch's charisma attracted people, while Hosea's wisdom kept them alive. Dutch dreamed big, while Hosea planned carefully. Together they formed the van der Linde gang, though at first it was just the 2 of them running cons and robberies across the frontier, taking from the rich and corrupt, while developing Dutch's philosophy about living free from society's chains. Dutch's philosophy, which he would articulate and refine over decades, centered on the idea that civilization as structured by governments and corporations was inherently corrupt and oppressive. He believed that laws existed primarily to protect the wealthy and powerful, while controlling and exploiting everyone else. Dutch saw himself and his gang as people who rejected this system, who lived according to their own rules based on loyalty, honour among thieves, and taking care of each other. He genuinely believed that outlawry could be a form of resistance against oppression, that robbing banks and trains was striking blows against institutions that robbed working people legally every day. This wasn't just rationalization for criminality, at least not initially. It was a coherent worldview that gave meaning and purpose to what could otherwise be just theft and violence. In 1877, Dutch and Hosea encountered a young Arthur Morgan, probably around 14 years old, orphaned and surviving through petty crime. Dutch saw potential in Arthur and took him in, not as a tool or subordinate, but as a son. Dutch taught Arthur to read and write, exposed him to books and ideas, treated him with affection and respect that Arthur had never received from his biological father. This wasn't manipulation or grooming in the cynical sense, though it certainly created loyalty that Dutch would later exploit. Dutch genuinely cared for Arthur and wanted to raise him better than Dutch himself had been raised. The education and philosophy Dutch provided Arthur were real gifts, even if they ultimately served Dutch's interest by creating a devoted follower who would do anything for him. The gang grew slowly but steadily through the 1880s and early 1890s. John Marston joined as a young teenager in the mid-1880s, another orphaned boy that Dutch took in and raised. Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and others joined over the years, each finding in Dutch's gang something they needed, whether that was protection, purpose, family, or just a place to belong. Dutch had a gift for identifying people who were lost or broken, and showing them how they could be part of something greater. His speeches about freedom and living by your own rules resonated with people who felt rejected or victimized by mainstream society. Dutch made outlawry seem noble, made robbery seem like resistance, made violence seem like justice. He was a masterful recruiter because he believed his own rhetoric, and that genuine conviction was contagious. Dutch's relationship with the women of the gang, particularly Annabelle, and later Molly O'Shea, reveals aspects of his character beyond just leadership. Annabelle was Dutch's great love in the earlier years, and her death at the hands of Colm O'Driscoll became the defining trauma of Dutch's life and the source of his hatred for his rival gang leader. The exact circumstances of Annabelle's death are never fully detailed, but it's clear she was killed because of Dutch, possibly captured and murdered to hurt him. Dutch never fully recovered from this loss, and it fed his paranoia and his willingness to use extreme violence against enemies. Molly O'Shea, who Dutch is with during the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, represents a different kind of relationship. She's younger, devoted to Dutch, but Dutch doesn't love her the way he loved Annabelle. Molly is more trophy than partner, and Dutch's treatment of her, caring but ultimately dismissive, shows how his narcissism affects even his intimate relationships. The Blackwater Ferry robbery in 1899, which occurs just before Red Dead Redemption 2 begins, marks the beginning of Dutch's visible decline. The job was supposed to be straightforward, robbing a ferry carrying significant money, but something went terribly wrong. The robbery turned into a massacre, with civilians killed and the law responding with overwhelming force. Dutch killed a woman named Heidi McCourt on the ferry, shooting her in the head during the chaos, an act that several gang members witnessed and that troubled them deeply. Dutch has killed before, but this killing felt different, more desperate and less controlled than his usual violence. The gang lost several members, including Mac and Davy Calander and Jenny Kirk, with John Marston badly wounded and Sean Maguire captured. They also had to leave behind the money Dutch had stashed, a significant amount that was supposed to fund their next moves. The aftermath of Blackwater shows Dutch under pressure for perhaps the first time in ways the gang hasn't seen before. They're fleeing into the mountains during a blizzard, running from lawmen and Pinkertons, their supplies inadequate and their situation desperate. Dutch makes decisions quickly, keeping the gang moving, but there's an edge of panic that the more observant members notice. He's still eloquent and charismatic, still able to rally the gang with speeches about surviving this setback and ultimate victory, but there's strain showing through. The competence that defined Dutch's leadership is starting to crack, and while Arthur and Hosea can compensate for now, they're both concerned about Dutch's state of mind. When the gang descends from the mountains and establishes camp at Horseshoe Overlook, Dutch tries to project confidence and control. He immediately starts planning their next moves, identifying opportunities in Valentine and the surrounding areas, making alliances and gathering information. But he's also making decisions that worry Hosea, like getting involved with the Greys and Braithwaites in Rhodes, playing both families against each other in a scheme that's clever in theory but risky in practice. Hosea argues for more caution, for smaller jobs and quieter operation until the heat from Blackwater dies down, but Dutch is impatient. He wants the big score that will solve everything, that will prove Blackwater was just a setback rather than the beginning of the end. Dutch's increasing reliance on Micah Bell is one of the most significant and damaging changes in his behaviour during 1899. Micah is everything that Arthur and Hosea are not. He's cruel without purpose, reckless in ways that endanger others, and obsequious toward Dutch in ways that feel manipulative. But Micah tells Dutch what he wants to hear, reinforces Dutch's grandiose self-image, encourages his worst impulses, and never questions his judgment. Dutch is drawn to this validation, especially as Hosea becomes more critical and Arthur more openly doubtful. The psychology here is clear. Dutch is surrounding himself with yes-men because he can't handle honest feedback anymore, because his narcissism requires constant affirmation. Micah recognizes this vulnerability and exploits it, gaining influence by feeding Dutch's ego. The death of Sean Maguire during the Greys' ambush in Rhodes affects Dutch visibly, though perhaps not as deeply as it should. Sean was young and loyal, someone who believed completely in Dutch's vision, and his sudden death should be a wake-up call about the dangers they're facing. Dutch gives a speech at Sean's funeral about sacrifice and how they have to keep going to honour the dead, which sounds meaningful but is really about justifying continuing down the same path rather than reconsidering their approach. This becomes a pattern. Dutch uses deaths to argue for escalation rather than caution, claiming that pulling back would mean those deaths were meaningless. It's a manipulation tactic, turning grief and guilt into motivation to stay committed to Dutch's plans. The situation with the Braithwaites and Greys escalates out of Dutch's control, culminating in Jack Marston being kidnapped. This is the moment when Dutch shows both his best and worst qualities simultaneously. The assault on Braithwaite Manor, where Dutch leads the gang in burning down the estate and killing Catherine Braithwaite, shows Dutch as a leader who will do anything to protect his people. He's furious, righteous, and absolutely committed to getting Jack back. But the situation also exists because of Dutch's plan to manipulate both families, a scheme that was always going to end badly. Dutch created the circumstances that led to Jack's kidnapping, but he frames his response as heroic rather than acknowledging his culpability. This ability to reframe his mistakes as opportunities to demonstrate loyalty becomes increasingly common. The move to Shady Bell and the gang's involvement with Angelo Bronte in St. Denis represents Dutch's ambitions growing beyond what's practical or safe. Bronte is a powerful crime boss with connections and resources that dwarf the gang's, but Dutch wants to play in the big leagues, wants to prove he can outmaneuver sophisticated urban criminals. His dealings with Bronte start civilly, with Bronte even hosting Dutch at his mansion and treating him with apparent respect. But the relationship sours when Dutch realizes Bronte is condescending to him, viewing him as an ignorant country outlaw rather than an equal. Dutch's ego can't handle this disrespect, and his response, feeding Bronte to an alligator and then robbing the trolley station Bronte had told them about as a setup, shows judgment giving way to ego and revenge. The bank robbery in St. Denis is Dutch's plan for the ultimate score, the one last big job that will give them enough money to disappear and live peacefully. The irony that Dutch has been promising one last job for years isn't lost on the gang's more observant members, but most go along because what else is there to do? Dutch's planning for the bank job is actually solid. He scouts the location, coordinates with the gang, has escape routes planned, but the Pinkertons are waiting. Someone tipped them off, and the job becomes a disaster. In the chaos, Hosea Matthews is captured and executed on the street by Agent Milton, killed in front of Dutch and the gang. Hosea's death is the loss of Dutch's oldest friend, his partner for over 25 years, the voice of reason that balanced Dutch's ambition. The impact on Dutch is immediate and catastrophic. Dutch's response to Hosea's death is to double down rather than retreat or grieve properly. He leads the gang's escape from St. Denis onto a riverboat they hijack, but a storm sinks the boat and they wash up on Guarma, a Caribbean island in the midst of revolution. The Guarma chapter is surreal, with Dutch helping revolutionaries overthrow a government that has nothing to do with his own problems. But Dutch thrives in this environment. He's needed again, making plans and leading men into battle, receiving respect and appreciation. The revolutionary leader they assist, Hercule Fontaine, treats Dutch as an equal and values his tactical thinking. This validation feels good to Dutch, reminds him of how things used to be, and he seems more energized and focused during the Guarma sequence than he's been in months. But Guarma is a distraction from the gang's real problems, and when they return to America, everything has fallen apart. The camp has been destroyed, members scattered or arrested, and they're more hunted and desperate than ever. Dutch's immediate response is to blame everyone else, to look for traitors and rats rather than accepting responsibility for the decisions that led them here. His paranoia, which had been growing, becomes acute. He starts questioning people's loyalty, seeing betrayal in ordinary disagreements, interpreting caution as cowardice or doubt as disloyalty. The gang that reconvenes at Beaver Hollow is fractured and afraid, and Dutch's leadership is no longer bringing them together but pushing them apart. Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis and his subsequent questioning of Dutch's plans represents the most significant challenge to Dutch's authority and ego. Arthur has been loyal for over 20 years, Dutch's first son and most trusted enforcer, and having Arthur doubt him is deeply threatening to Dutch. Dutch responds by alternating between trying to win Arthur back through appeals to their history and punishing Arthur by siding with Micah and excluding Arthur from planning. Dutch can't simply accept that Arthur's doubts might be valid, that Arthur might be raising legitimate concerns out of care for the gang rather than disloyalty. Dutch's narcissism requires that disagreement equals betrayal, that questioning him means turning against him. The failed oil deal where Dutch leaves Arthur to die is the clearest indication of how far Dutch has fallen. In the past, Dutch would have moved heaven and earth to save a gang member, especially Arthur. But during the oil deal negotiations with Leviticus Cornwall, when Cornwall's men turn on them and everything goes wrong, Dutch flees and leaves Arthur behind to be captured and likely killed. Arthur survives through his own skills, but the betrayal is profound. When Arthur confronts Dutch about being left behind, Dutch makes excuses and tries to gaslight Arthur into thinking it wasn't abandonment. This moment destroys whatever trust remained between them and shows Dutch prioritizing his own survival over his supposed son's. Dutch's relationship with eagle flies and the Wapiti tribe shows him at his most cynically manipulative. He presents himself as an ally to the Native Americans fighting against government oppression, drawing parallels between their situation and his own. Dutch speaks eloquently about freedom and resistance, and standing up to powerful interests that want to destroy their way of life. Eagle Flies, young and angry and desperate for solutions, is drawn to Dutch's rhetoric and leadership. But Dutch is using the tribe for his own purposes. He needs their numbers and their willingness to fight to help him rob the army payroll train. Rains fall. Eaglefly's father and the tribe's chief sees through Dutch immediately, recognizing him as a man who talks about principles while pursuing selfish interests. The Native American storyline shows Dutch's philosophy revealed as hollow rhetoric, masking selfishness. The train robbery that results in Eaglefly's death and the further destruction of the Wapiti tribe is one of Dutch's most morally reprehensible acts. He encouraged Eagleflies to violence, used the tribe's desperation to further his own goals, and when everything went wrong, Dutch walked away while the Native Americans suffered the consequences. Arthur, dying and disillusioned, sees this clearly and condemns Dutch for it, but Dutch deflects and justifies. In Dutch's mind, he gave Eagleflies an opportunity to strike back at his oppressors, and if it didn't work out, that's not Dutch's fault. This inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his actions is central to Dutch's character. He can never admit fault because that would mean acknowledging that his judgment is flawed and his philosophy is bankrupt. The revelation that the Pinkertons have been getting inside information creates the witch hunt for the rat that dominates the gang's final days. Dutch is certain there's a traitor, and his paranoia leads him to suspect everyone except the actual rat, Micah. The irony is obvious to players, but not to Dutch. He trusts Micah completely while suspecting Arthur, John, and others who've been loyal for years. This shows how Dutch's judgment has been completely corrupted. He can't distinguish truth from lies or loyalty from betrayal anymore. His criteria for trust have become entirely about who validates his ego, rather than who has actually proven themselves over time. Micah passes this test because he constantly tells Dutch how brilliant and strong he is, while Arthur fails because he questions and criticizes. Dutch's descent into what Arthur and others start calling madness is really the revelation of who Dutch has always been. The philosophy about freedom and living by your own rules was always partly performance, a way to make criminality seem noble and to attract followers. The love he showed Arthur and John and others was real but conditional, dependent on their continued obedience and validation of Dutch. The intelligence and strategic thinking were genuine, but always in service of Dutch's ego and desire for significance. What changes in 1899 isn't that Dutch becomes someone different. It's that pressure and failure strip away the veneer and reveal the narcissism and selfishness that were always at his core. The ideals were real enough when following them benefited Dutch, but when tested by genuine hardship, they proved to be less important than Dutch's self-image and survival. The final confrontation between Arthur and Dutch, when Arthur openly accuses Dutch of betraying the gang's principles and abandoning the people who followed him, is devastating because Dutch can't respond with substance. He deflects, he appeals to their history, he tries to make Arthur feel guilty for doubting him, but he doesn't actually defend his actions or explain how his recent decisions align with the values he supposedly holds. Dutch's response to criticism has become entirely about attacking the critic, rather than addressing the criticism. When Arthur won't back down, when he continues pointing out Dutch's failures and betrayals, Dutch's only response is to side more completely with Micah, and to basically disown Arthur, the son he raised and who gave him everything for 20 years. John Marston's capture and Dutch's initial refusal to mount a rescue represents perhaps the most damning betrayal. In the old days, the gang would have immediately launched a rescue because you don't abandon your people. That was the whole point of the gang. But Dutch makes excuses, says they need to be smart and plan carefully, buys time by doing nothing. Arthur realizes that Dutch isn't planning a rescue at all, that Dutch is willing to let John die or rot in prison because rescuing him would be risky and wouldn't advance Dutch's goals. This is when Arthur fully accepts that Dutch is gone, that the man who raised him and who he loved as a father has become someone who will sacrifice anyone for his own interests. Arthur decides to rescue John with or without Dutch, finally putting what's right above loyalty to Dutch. The final sequence of missions shows Dutch's complete moral collapse. He and Micah plan to take the Blackwater money and run, abandoning everyone else, including people who followed Dutch for years. When Arthur and John confront them, Dutch's response is to threaten them and side entirely with Micah, the man who's been betraying them to the Pinkertons all along. Dutch holds a gun on both Arthur and John at various points, actually willing to kill them despite everything they've meant to him. This is Dutch choosing his ego and his denial over everything and everyone else. He can't admit that Micah betrayed him because that would mean admitting his judgment was wrong, so he has to double down even if it means murdering his sons. Arthur's death on the mountain, whether he dies from tuberculosis after ensuring John's escape or is shot by Micah depending on honour level, happens with Dutch watching. In the high honour ending, Arthur tells Dutch, "I gave you all I had before dying as the sun rises, a peaceful death earned by redemption." Dutch doesn't respond to Arthur's final words, just stands there watching, and then walks away, leaving Arthur's body behind. This moment shows Dutch at his worst, unable to acknowledge Arthur's sacrifice or his own role in Arthur's death, unable to feel appropriate grief or guilt, just walking away because dealing with it would require honesty Dutch isn't capable of. The man who once took in orphaned Arthur and raised him as a son leaves Arthur's corpse on a mountain without a word. Dutch's fate between 1899 and 1911, when the first Red Dead Redemption takes place, is largely unknown, but can be partially reconstructed from evidence and dialogue. He and Micah took the Blackwater money, though how they divided it or how long they stayed together is unclear. At some point, Dutch learned that Micah was the rat, either through direct evidence or because it became undeniable. This knowledge should have destroyed Dutch, should have forced him to confront that Arthur and John were right about Micah, and that Dutch's judgment was catastrophically wrong. But Dutch's response seems to have been to externalize the blame, to view Micah's betrayal as unique rather than recognizing the pattern of Dutch's own poor decisions. By 1907, 8 years after Arthur's death, Dutch has formed a new gang. This gang is different from the van der Linde gang in crucial ways. It's more violent and less principled, more focused on basic criminality than any pretense of revolutionary idealism. Dutch is operating in the mountains, running with Native Americans, including a man who becomes a trusted lieutenant, possibly filling the role that Arthur once held. This new gang exists partly because Dutch can't function without followers and power, and partly because Dutch is still pursuing the same dreams of freedom and escape that motivated him before, despite everything that's happened. The difference is that Dutch's rhetoric about ideals has thinned considerably. His new followers follow him more out of pragmatism or lack of options than belief in his philosophy. During this period, Dutch and his gang get involved in a situation near Blackwater, and this brings them into conflict with John Marston, who's attempting to build a legitimate life with his family on Beecher's Hope Ranch. John has done exactly what Arthur told him to do: run and never look back, be a good father and husband, leave the outlaw life. But circumstances force John to confront his past, and that past includes Dutch. The confrontation between Dutch and John in 1907, during the events of Red Dead Redemption's first epilogue, shows that Dutch hasn't changed substantially. He's still charismatic and eloquent, still believes in his own mythology, still sees himself as someone fighting for freedom against oppressive forces, but he's also more bitter and paranoid, more explicitly violent, less concerned with even the appearance of morality. Dutch's relationship with Micah during this period is complex and ultimately murderous. Micah formed his own gang after splitting from Dutch, operating in the mountains and continuing his pattern of cruelty and criminality. Dutch eventually tracks down Micah, possibly because he learned definitively that Micah was the rat, or possibly for other reasons related to the money or settling accounts. When John Marston and Sadie Adler track Micah to his mountain hideout in 1907, planning to kill him for betraying Arthur and the gang, they find Dutch already there. The confrontation between Dutch, Micah and John is tense and complicated, with Dutch seemingly allied with Micah, but his actual intentions unclear. When the shooting starts, Dutch shoots Micah, killing the man who betrayed the gang and who Dutch had chosen over Arthur. Then Dutch shoots Micah again, and then walks away without explanation, leaving John and Sadie with the body and with the Blackwater money that Micah had been keeping. This moment is open to interpretation. Is Dutch finally taking responsibility for his mistakes by killing the rat? Is he seeking revenge for Micah's betrayal? Is he trying to make amends to John? Or is he simply tying up loose ends and eliminating someone who had become inconvenient? Dutch doesn't explain his motivations, just kills Micah and leaves, and this ambiguity is characteristic of Dutch's entire character. Even his most significant actions resist simple interpretation. By 1911, when the main events of Red Dead Redemption occur, Dutch has formed yet another gang, this time operating in the mountains of West Elizabeth and New Austin. This gang is explicitly revolutionary in rhetoric, if not in action, with Dutch styling himself as a leader of Native Americans fighting against the government's oppression and betrayal. Dutch's recruitment of Native American followers makes sense from his perspective. They're people who've been genuinely victimized by the government, who have legitimate grievances, and who might believe Dutch's rhetoric about freedom and resistance. But Dutch is also using them, just like he used Eaglefly's tribe in 1899 as tools for his own agenda and his own ego. The Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, has identified Dutch as a significant threat and wants him captured or killed. They force John Marston into service by holding his family hostage, giving John no choice but to hunt down his former brothers, including Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and ultimately Dutch. John doesn't want this assignment, has tried to leave his past behind, but the government won't let him be until he delivers the men they want. This setup creates the tragic circumstance of John having to destroy what remains of his old family to protect his current family, forced to kill or capture people he once loved, because the law gives him no alternative. When John finally confronts Dutch in 1911, Dutch has established himself as a leader of a Native American resistance movement, operating from a mountain stronghold. Dutch presents himself as fighting for indigenous rights and freedom, as standing against government oppression, as protecting people who can't protect themselves. There's truth to the fact that the government has treated Native Americans with horrific cruelty and injustice, but Dutch's involvement isn't really about helping them as much as it's about Dutch finding a cause that allows him to see himself as righteous. The Native Americans following Dutch are pawns in his game just like everyone else who's followed him, though Dutch would never admit or possibly even recognize this. The government's assault on Dutch's stronghold is overwhelming, with soldiers and lawmen attacking the mountain position where Dutch and his gang have fortified themselves. John is part of this assault, though conflicted about his role in it, still feeling loyalty to Dutch despite everything that's happened. During the battle, Dutch's gang is destroyed, his followers killed or scattered, everything he's built once again collapsing into violence and death. Dutch himself ends up on a cliff edge, surrounded by John and government agents, with no escape route and no way to win. This is the end for Dutch van der Linde, the final confrontation that will determine his fate. Dutch's final words to John are characteristically complex and open to interpretation. He says, "We can't always fight nature, John. We can't fight change. We can't fight gravity. We can't fight nothing. My whole life, all I ever did was fight." These words show Dutch at his most self-aware, acknowledging that his entire existence has been about resistance and struggle, that he's spent his life fighting against forces he couldn't defeat. There's resignation in these words, but also a kind of justification, framing his life as tragic but meaningful, as noble resistance even if doomed to fail. Dutch is still performing even in his final moments, still crafting the narrative of his life to cast himself in the best possible light. Then Dutch says, "But I can't fight my own nature. I can't fight my own nature." This is the closest Dutch ever comes to acknowledging his fundamental character flaws, admitting that he's trapped by who he is, unable to change or escape the patterns that have defined his life. But even this confession is somewhat exculpatory. It frames his flaws as inevitable aspects of his nature rather than choices he made, suggesting he couldn't have been different rather than that he chose not to change. Dutch is still avoiding full responsibility, even as he admits to his failures, still maintaining that he's more victim of circumstance and nature than active agent of his own destruction. After these words, Dutch backs up toward the cliff edge. John tells him not to do it, that they can talk, that there are alternatives to dying here. But Dutch isn't interested in alternatives, isn't interested in capture or trial or imprisonment. For Dutch, being taken by the government would be the ultimate defeat, confirmation that everything he believed and fought for was wrong. He can't face that reality, can't accept that kind of ending to his story. So Dutch chooses his own ending, stepping backward off the cliff, falling to his death in the river below. His body is recovered by the authorities, confirming his death and ending the legend of Dutch van der Linde. Dutch's suicide is the ultimate act of control over his narrative. He denied the government the satisfaction of capturing him, denied them the trial and execution that would have been the official ending to his story. By killing himself, Dutch maintained agency over his fate to the very end, choosing the time and manner of his death rather than letting others decide. This is consistent with Dutch's character throughout his life. He needed control and authority, needed to be the one making decisions and determining outcomes. Losing that control was unacceptable, so death was preferable to submission. The question of whether Dutch's philosophy had any validity, or whether it was always just rationalization for criminality, is central to understanding his character. In the beginning, there's evidence that Dutch genuinely believed in the ideas he espoused. He was well-read and thoughtful. His criticisms of government and corporate oppression weren't wrong, even if his solutions were violent and criminal. The Gilded Age in American history really was a time when robber barons exploited workers and governments served wealthy interests over the common good. Dutch wasn't inventing these critiques. He was drawing from actual anarchist and socialist political philosophy that existed in this period. His mistake wasn't in identifying injustice, it was in thinking that robbing and killing could address systemic problems, in believing that outlawry was revolutionary rather than just criminal. Over time, Dutch's philosophy became increasingly hollow, more about justifying his actions and maintaining his self-image than about genuine principles. The shift was gradual, and probably not something Dutch consciously recognised. Each compromise and contradiction could be rationalised individually, but collectively they revealed that Dutch's ideals were negotiable whenever they conflicted with his ego or survival. By 1899, Dutch is using the language of freedom and resistance to justify decisions that are purely about his own power and control. By 1911, his revolutionary rhetoric is transparently self-serving, a performance for followers who want to believe they're fighting for something meaningful, when really they're just following another outlaw using them for his own purposes. The tragedy of Dutch is that he had the intelligence and charisma to actually build something meaningful, to create a genuine alternative community, or to organise legitimate resistance to injustice. But he couldn't escape his own ego and his need for control and validation. If Dutch had been more humble, more willing to listen to wisdom from Hosea and others, more able to admit mistakes and change course, he might have led the gang to actually achieve some version of their dream. But his narcissism made that impossible. He needed to be the hero of his own story, needed to be right always, needed others to follow him unconditionally. These psychological needs ultimately mattered more to Dutch than the ideals he claimed to serve. Dutch's relationships with the surrogate sons he raised, Arthur and John particularly, reveal the complexity and ultimate toxicity of his love. He genuinely cared for these boys, gave them education and purpose and family when they had nothing, treated them with affection and respect. But Dutch's love was always conditional on their loyalty and deference. It was a father's love mixed with a cult leader's need for devotion. When Arthur and John grew into men with their own judgment and started questioning Dutch's decisions, Dutch couldn't handle it. He needed sons who would follow blindly, and when they stopped doing that, he was willing to let them die, or even kill them himself. This reveals that Dutch's love was ultimately about Dutch's needs, rather than truly being about the well-being of the people he claimed to love. The parallel between Dutch and Colm O'Driscoll, his hated rival, is something Dutch could never acknowledge but becomes obvious to observers. Both men are gang leaders who use idealistic rhetoric to justify criminality. Both inspire loyalty from followers who believe they're part of something meaningful. Both are willing to sacrifice their people for personal goals. Both are narcissists who need power and validation. The main difference is that Colm doesn't even pretend to have principles. He's honest about being a criminal doing criminal things for money and power. Dutch's pretense of idealism makes him worse in some ways, because it adds hypocrisy to the same basic criminality. Colm never claims to be better than what he is, while Dutch's entire identity is built on claiming moral superiority while doing the same terrible things. Dutch's impact on American history, at least within the game's fictional universe, is significant even if his dreams of revolution never materialized. He led gangs that robbed banks and trains, killed lawmen and civilians, eluded capture for decades, and inspired others to similar outlawry. The government took him seriously enough to deploy significant resources to hunt him, suggesting he represented a genuine threat to order and stability. But his impact is ultimately destructive rather than constructive. He didn't change systems or inspire lasting movements. He just created chaos and death before being destroyed himself. The West was being settled and civilized regardless of Dutch's resistance, and his violence didn't slow that process or help the people supposedly being oppressed by it. The question of Dutch's sanity, particularly in 1899 when multiple characters describe him as going mad, is complicated because Dutch's problems aren't really about mental illness in the clinical sense. He doesn't have schizophrenia or other conditions that would impair his grasp on reality. His problems are psychological and characterological. He's a narcissist whose ego can't handle challenges to his authority and self-image. He's paranoid because guilt and fear make him see threats everywhere. He's increasingly erratic because pressure is overwhelming his ability to maintain the composed facade. Calling Dutch crazy is convenient shorthand for explaining his decline, but it's not quite accurate. Dutch is accountable for his choices in ways that someone with actual mental illness might not be. His decisions flow from his character flaws rather than from disease or disability. Dutch's legacy for the surviving gang members is entirely negative. He destroyed everyone who trusted him, killed or contributed to the deaths of most of his followers, betrayed the principles he claimed to uphold, and left nothing of value behind. Arthur died young after wasting his life on Dutch's doomed dreams. John was forced back into outlawry and eventually killed by the government because of his association with Dutch. Hosea was executed in the street. Eagle Flies died because Dutch encouraged his recklessness. Countless others died in robberies and shootouts and government assaults on Dutch's various gangs. Even Dutch's final gang in 1911, composed largely of Native Americans who believed his rhetoric about fighting oppression, were slaughtered when the government attacked. Dutch's entire life was a trail of bodies, many of them people who trusted him and believed in him. The few survivors who escaped Dutch's influence, like Charles Smith and Sadie Adler, managed to build lives after the gang's collapse specifically because they got away from Dutch. Charles goes north to Canada and lives with Native Americans, finding peace and purpose. Sadie becomes a bounty hunter and eventually leaves America for South America. Both found ways to survive and even thrive after cutting ties with Dutch's doomed endeavours. Their survival demonstrates that Dutch was the problem, that his leadership and philosophy weren't protecting people from a cruel world, but rather leading them into unnecessary danger and death. Dutch's intelligence makes his failures more damning rather than less so. He wasn't a stupid man led astray by circumstances beyond his comprehension. He was smart enough to understand what was happening and make better choices. His education and philosophical knowledge gave him tools to analyze situations and recognize patterns, but his ego prevented him from applying those tools to his own behavior. Dutch could eloquently analyze how governments and corporations manipulate people, but he couldn't see how he was doing the same thing to his own followers. He could recognize when others were being hypocritical or self-serving, but he couldn't apply that same critical lens to himself. This selective blindness wasn't accidental or unconscious. It was motivated reasoning in service of protecting Dutch's self-image. The contrast between Dutch's public persona and his private actions reveals the performance at the heart of his identity. In front of the gang, Dutch is eloquent and inspiring, speaking about loyalty and family and freedom with apparent sincerity. In private moments, particularly in 1899 when stress is overwhelming him, Dutch's mask slips, and you can see the calculation and manipulation. The way he interacts differently with different gang members, tailoring his approach to what each person needs to hear, shows sophisticated understanding of psychology and influence. Dutch is always performing, always aware of his image and his effect on others, never simply being authentic without consideration for how he's perceived. Dutch's reading habits and his references to philosophy and literature throughout both games show that his education was genuine and extensive. He quotes or paraphrases thinkers like Evelyn Miller, a fictional philosopher within the game's universe. and references real historical and philosophical concepts accurately. Dutch reads books constantly, and his tent in every camp is filled with them, suggesting this isn't just affectation, but genuine interest. The tragedy is that all this education and all these ideas don't make Dutch a better person or leader. They just give him more sophisticated tools for manipulation and rationalization. Intelligence without wisdom or humility is dangerous, and Dutch is a perfect example of how smart people can use their intelligence to justify terrible things. The role of Evelyn Miller, the philosopher that Dutch admires and eventually meets, provides interesting commentary on Dutch's character. Miller is a writer who romanticizes Native American culture and frontier life, speaking eloquently about freedom and resistance to civilization's corruption. When Dutch finally meets Miller, who has become a hermit living in the wilderness to practice what he preaches, the encounter is awkward and uncomfortable. Miller is essentially a fraud, or at least a hypocrite, someone whose romantic ideas don't survive contact with the reality of actually living them. Dutch doesn't seem to fully recognize that Miller's failure reflects on his own similar contradictions between rhetoric and reality, or if he does recognize it, he doesn't let it change his own behavior. Dutch's relationship with law enforcement evolves from cat-and-mouse game to existential threat across his criminal career. In the earlier years, the gang could rob and disappear, staying ahead of local sheriffs who had limited resources and jurisdiction. But by 1899, the Pinkertons are involved, representing federal authority with nationwide reach and significant resources. Dutch's methods that worked against frontier lawmen are inadequate against professional investigators who use informants, coordinate across jurisdictions, and have backing from wealthy interests who want the gang destroyed. Dutch's failure to adapt his tactics to match the evolved threat shows his rigidity, his inability to recognize when circumstances have changed and old approaches won't work anymore. Agent Milton and Agent Ross, the Pinkertons hunting the gang, represent everything Dutch claims to hate about modern America. They work for wealthy interests, use ruthless methods, show no concern for justice or fairness, only results. They're willing to coerce John by holding his family hostage, to make deals with criminals to catch bigger criminals, to kill without legal process when convenient. In different circumstances, Dutch might point to men like Milton and Ross as proof that the system is corrupt and law enforcement serves power rather than justice. But his own crimes and the suffering he's caused make it impossible to view Dutch as righteous resistance against corrupt authority. He's just another violent criminal being hunted by other violent men in service of wealthy interests. Neither side has moral high ground. The question of what Dutch could have been if circumstances were different is interesting, but ultimately pointless speculation. Could Dutch have been a legitimate political organizer or labour leader, using his charisma and intelligence for actual positive change? Could he have been a successful businessman or professional, applying his strategic thinking to legal enterprises? The answer is probably no, because Dutch's fundamental character flaws would have manifested in any context. Narcissists cause damage in every field they enter, whether that's crime, business, politics, or any other domain. Dutch's specific path as an outlaw gang leader was shaped by his circumstances, but the underlying patterns of manipulation, ego, and inability to accept responsibility would have emerged however his life unfolded. Dutch's paranoia about traitors and rats becomes increasingly intense throughout 1899, and this paranoia serves multiple psychological functions for him. It externalizes blame, suggesting that the gang's problems come from betrayal rather than Dutch's poor leadership. It creates a threat that justifies increasing control and intolerance of dissent. Anyone who questions Dutch can be suspected of being a rat. It provides an enemy to focus on other than the real problems facing the gang, and it allows Dutch to avoid confronting that his plans aren't working by suggesting they would work if not for sabotage. The paranoia is self-fulfilling in a sense. Dutch's suspicions and accusations create the divisions and lack of trust that actually do threaten the gang's cohesion. The irony that Dutch trusts Micah, the actual rat, while suspecting Arthur and others who have proven their loyalty, is the clearest evidence of how corrupted Dutch's judgment has become. Micah is obvious in his untrustworthiness to everyone except Dutch. His cruelty and recklessness and manipulation are transparent. But Micah validates Dutch's ego and tells him what he wants to hear, and that becomes more important to Dutch than the decades of loyalty and sacrifice that Arthur and others have demonstrated. This shows that Dutch's priorities have inverted. He cares more about feeling good about himself than about the gang's actual well-being, more about short-term validation than long-term wisdom. Dutch's treatment of women throughout his life reflects his general narcissism and his view of people as serving functions in his life rather than being autonomous individuals deserving respect. Annabelle seems to have been genuinely loved, but even that relationship served Dutch's needs for companionship and validation. Molly O'Shea is more obviously a trophy, younger and devoted, but not truly valued by Dutch as a partner. When Molly becomes demanding of attention and jealous of Dutch's focus on gang business, Dutch becomes dismissive and cold, unable to provide the emotional support and reassurance she needs. Molly's eventual false confession to being a rat, made in desperate attempt to hurt Dutch or get his attention, results in her death, and Dutch shows no significant guilt or grief. She was useful to him when she validated his ego, and when she became inconvenient, she became disposable. The other women in the gang, including Mary Beth, Tilly, Karen and Abigail, are generally treated better than they might be in other outlaw gangs, with Dutch maintaining standards about respect and prohibiting sexual exploitation. This represents Dutch's better impulses and his legitimate desire to create a community with different values than mainstream society. But these women still exist in subordinate roles, their labour supporting the men who do the important work of robbing and fighting. The gang structure reflects the patriarchal assumptions of 1899 society, despite Dutch's rhetoric about freedom and rejecting social norms. Dutch's ideals extended only so far, not far enough to genuinely reimagine gender relations or give women equal authority in gang decision-making. Susan Grimshaw, the camp matriarch who manages day-to-day operations and supervises the women, is the closest thing to female leadership in the gang, but her authority is clearly subordinate to Dutch's, and she never questions the fundamental hierarchy. Her loyalty to Dutch is absolute, and she dies defending him even after everything has fallen apart. Susan's death during the gang's final dissolution is barely acknowledged by Dutch, just another casualty in the chaos he created, despite her decades of service and devotion. This dismissal of Susan's sacrifice, like so many other dismissals of gang members' sacrifices, shows how little Dutch ultimately values the people who give everything for him. Dutch's physical appearance and presentation are carefully maintained even as circumstances become desperate, showing his vanity and his awareness that image matters. He dresses well, keeps himself clean and groomed, speaks eloquently and gestures theatrically when making speeches. This attention to presentation is both strength and weakness. It makes him impressive and memorable. But it also shows how much he cares about how others see him, rather than who he actually is. Even in Beaver Hollow, when the gang is falling apart and they're living in a cave, Dutch maintains his appearance, while others become ragged and desperate. This disconnect between Dutch's polished exterior and the gang's desperate reality is almost darkly comic, showing Dutch performing confidence and control even as everything crumbles. The speeches Dutch delivers throughout both games are masterpieces of rhetoric and manipulation, combining genuine philosophical insight with emotional appeals and logical fallacies. He knows how to structure an argument, how to use repetition and metaphor, how to modulate his voice for effect. He appeals to shared values and common enemies, frames everything in terms of us versus them, uses loaded language that triggers emotional responses. If Dutch had lived in a different era, he could have been a successful politician or preacher, or any profession that required swaying audiences. But he also uses these skills to manipulate people into doing things that harm them, to convince them to stay loyal when they should leave, to rationalize the irrational. Dutch's inability to accept defeat or admit mistakes stems from deep insecurity about his worth and competence. For Dutch, being wrong doesn't just mean making an error in judgment. It threatens his entire identity as a brilliant leader and visionary. This is why he doubles down when challenged rather than reconsidering, why he escalates when he should retreat, why he attacks people who point out his mistakes rather than learning from the feedback. This psychological pattern is common in narcissistic leaders across contexts. The need to be right becomes more important than actually achieving goals, and the leader will sacrifice everything, including the organization and people they supposedly care about, rather than admit fault. The cycle of promising one more job that will fix everything is Dutch's signature pattern, and becomes a dark joke among gang members who recognize they've heard it before. Each time a job fails or doesn't provide enough money, Dutch immediately starts planning the next one that will definitely be enough. The pattern reveals Dutch's fundamental delusion. He believes that external circumstances are the problem rather than his approach or philosophy. If they just get enough money, if they just escape to the right location, if they just pull off the right score, then everything will work out. This thinking prevents Dutch from recognizing that the problem is internal, that his leadership is flawed and his dream is unrealistic regardless of how much money they steal or where they run. Dutch's relationship with Hosea Matthews is the most important and complex relationship of his life, more significant than any romantic partnership or surrogate fatherhood. Hosea was Dutch's partner for over 25 years, the person who balanced Dutch's ambition with pragmatism, who could tell Dutch hard truths because of their history and mutual respect. Hosea's increasing concerns about Dutch's judgment in 1899, his advocacy for caution and smaller scores, represents the last chance for Dutch to change course before disaster. But Dutch stops listening to Hosea, dismisses his concerns as cowardice or lack of faith, lets Micah's voice drown out the wisdom of his oldest friend. When Hosea is killed in St. Denis, Dutch loses the last person who could moderate his worst impulses and call out his delusions. Dutch's grief at Hosea's death is genuine and profound, shown in his devastated reaction to seeing Hosea executed. But Dutch processes this grief in destructive ways, using it to justify escalation rather than reflection. Hosea died trying to execute Dutch's plan, so Dutch frames Hosea's death as sacrifice that obligates everyone else to continue down the same path rather than as consequence of Dutch's poor planning. This is typical of how Dutch handles all losses. He transforms them into martyrdom that justifies his decisions rather than acknowledging his role in causing them. Hosea's wisdom dies with him, but Dutch never seriously considers what Hosea would advise in subsequent situations, never truly honours Hosea's perspective by incorporating it into his thinking. The comparison between how Dutch leads in the early missions of RDR2 versus later missions shows his deterioration clearly. Early on, Dutch is patient and strategic, listening to input from Arthur and Hosea, adapting plans when circumstances change, showing genuine concern for gang member safety. His decisions make sense even if they're risky, and he demonstrates the intelligence and capability that made people follow him in the first place. Later, Dutch becomes impulsive and rigid, dismissing concerns, refusing to adapt, making decisions based on ego rather than gang welfare. The contrast shows that Dutch's decline isn't just about external pressure, but about internal corruption, his worst qualities overwhelming his better ones as stress increases. Dutch's talent for reading people and understanding their motivations is both gift and curse. He can identify what people need, what they fear, what motivates them, and he uses this knowledge to recruit, to motivate, and increasingly to manipulate. This emotional intelligence makes Dutch effective, but also makes him dangerous because he can push people's buttons and exploit their vulnerabilities so skillfully. Arthur recognizes by the end that Dutch is playing people, using his understanding of psychology like a weapon against them. The talent that made Dutch an effective leader becomes a tool of abuse when divorced from genuine care for people's well-being. The locations Dutch chooses for camps throughout RDR2 reflect his deteriorating judgment and circumstances. Horseshoe Overlook is pleasant and practical, providing safety and resources. Clemens Point is beautiful lakeside property, suggesting optimism about settling there longer term. Shady Bell is a decaying mansion near St. Denis, showing ambition to operate in urban environment despite impracticality. Beaver Hollow is a miserable cave in harsh mountains, desperate and grim. The progression of camps tells the story of the gang's decline, from comfortable and hopeful to barely surviving in hostile environment. Dutch's choice of Beaver Hollow over other options shows how divorced he's become from caring about the gang's well-being versus just hiding from pursuers. Dutch's final stand in 1911, on a cliff surrounded by government forces with no escape, is the inevitable conclusion to his life story. He lived by violence and resistance to authority, and he died the same way, refusing surrender even when defeat was certain. The romanticism of Dutch's suicide, choosing death over capture, fits the legend he tried to create about himself. But it's also deeply selfish, a final act prioritizing Dutch's self-image over any larger consideration. He could have surrendered and testified about government abuses against Native Americans, using his trial as a platform for the principles he claimed to believe in. But that would require humility and accepting loss of control, which Dutch couldn't do. So he jumped, ending his story on his terms, but also ending any possibility of his life meaning something beyond destruction. The Native Americans who followed Dutch in his final years were pawns in his game just like everyone else. Perhaps even more so because Dutch was explicitly using their legitimate grievances as cover for his own agenda. Dutch didn't improve their situation or help their cause in any meaningful way. He just gave them false hope before leading them into a battle they couldn't win against overwhelming government force. The Native Americans who died in the assault on Dutch's stronghold died for Dutch's ego, not for their own freedom or rights. This is Dutch's consistent pattern across his life, presenting himself as ally and protector to vulnerable people while actually exploiting them for his purposes. The question of whether Dutch ever truly loved anyone or whether all his relationships were ultimately about what people could do for him is difficult to answer definitively. Dutch was capable of affection and demonstrated care for certain individuals, particularly in his relationship with Arthur as a young man and his partnership with Hosea. But Dutch's love was always entangled with his need for validation and control, making it impossible to separate genuine caring from narcissistic need. When push came to shove, when loving someone required sacrificing his ego or admitting fault, Dutch chose himself every time. This pattern suggests that whatever love Dutch felt was conditional and subordinate to self-interest, making it a shallow and ultimately selfish kind of love. Dutch's death resolves nothing in terms of the larger forces he claimed to fight against. The government continues oppressing Native Americans, corporations continue exploiting workers, wealth inequality persists, and all the injustices Dutch railed against remain unaddressed. His decades of robbery and violence didn't change any systems or help any movements. They just created chaos and death before being suppressed by the same authorities that controlled everything before Dutch's rebellion. This is the ultimate futility of Dutch's approach. You can't rob your way to social change. Violence without strategy or mass support just gets you killed while leaving the system intact. Dutch was smart enough to recognize injustice, but not wise enough to understand how to actually address it. The legacy Dutch leaves for American history, at least within the game's universe, is as a footnote about colourful outlaws from the closing frontier, not as a revolutionary or freedom fighter. He'll be remembered as a criminal who killed lawmen and civilians, robbed banks and trains, and eventually committed suicide rather than face justice. The philosophy and ideals he espoused won't be remembered because they were revealed as hollow rhetoric masking selfishness and violence. The people who knew him personally, the surviving gang members, remember him with bitterness and disappointment rather than admiration. John has to kill his former brothers because of Dutch's decisions, and while John doesn't hate Dutch, he recognizes that following him was a mistake that cost decades and countless lives. Dutch's intelligence makes his story more tragic rather than less so, because a smarter person could have recognized the patterns and changed course. Dutch had multiple opportunities to see that his approach wasn't working, to listen to wisdom from Hosea and Arthur, to recognize that circumstances had changed and required different strategies. But his ego prevented learning and adaptation. His narcissism required that he be right always, and these psychological limitations meant his intelligence couldn't save him from himself. Smart people can be incredibly self-destructive when intelligence is coupled with poor character, and Dutch exemplifies how brilliance without wisdom or humility leads to catastrophe. The parallel between Dutch's death in 1911 and Arthur's death in 1899 highlights the difference between them. Arthur died having achieved redemption, having ensured John's escape, having become a better man in his final months. His death was meaningful sacrifice that accomplished something beyond himself. Dutch died having achieved nothing except his own death, having learned nothing, having changed nothing, clinging to delusions and ego to the end. His death was waste, the final act of a wasted life, meaningful only as conclusion to a cautionary tale about narcissism and failed leadership. Both men died in the mountains, but the meaning of their deaths couldn't be more different. The video game medium allows exploration of Dutch's character across 2 full games spanning decades, providing depth and complexity that would be difficult to achieve in film or literature. Players spend hundreds of hours with Dutch across both games, hearing his speeches, watching his decisions, seeing his relationships evolve. This extended exposure creates understanding of Dutch's character that feels earned rather than told. The interactive nature of games also means players experience Dutch's impact directly through playing, as characters he affected, feeling the frustration of following flawed leadership as Arthur, and feeling the tragedy of being forced to hunt him as John. The medium serves the character brilliantly, making Dutch one of gaming's most memorable antagonists precisely because he's so fully realised across so much content. Dutch van der Linde represents failed idealism, showing how genuine desire for better world can be corrupted by ego and poor character into something destructive. He started with real critiques of society and legitimate desire to create alternative community based on different values. But the foundation was rotten because Dutch's motivation was ultimately about himself rather than the ideals, about his own significance and legend rather than actually helping people or changing systems. The progression from young idealist to paranoid tyrant to suicidal fugitive is tragic, but inevitable given Dutch's character flaws. He was always going to end badly because he couldn't be the person his philosophy required, couldn't subordinate ego to principles, couldn't accept that being a true revolutionary requires humility and sacrifice of self-interest that his narcissism made impossible. The influence of Dutch's story on video game narratives about leadership and loyalty has been substantial. Many games feature charismatic leaders who turn out to be corrupt or delusional, but few develop the arc as thoroughly or with such nuance as Dutch's story across the Red Dead games. Dutch is neither purely evil nor purely sympathetic. He's complex and human and understandable, while also being clearly wrong and harmful. This complexity makes him feel real, and makes the tragedy of characters who follow him feel earned rather than contrived. The games trust players to see Dutch's flaws without needing to explicitly condemn him, showing rather than telling how and why he fails. Dutch's final words about fighting his nature acknowledge that he understands himself at some level, that he recognizes he's trapped by who he is. But this recognition comes too late and doesn't represent genuine change or redemption, just final moment of clarity before death. Dutch dies as he lived, on his own terms, dramatic and defiant, still crafting his narrative even in his last seconds. He couldn't change, couldn't grow, couldn't escape the prison of his own character. That's the tragedy of Dutch van der Linde, that he had the intelligence to understand what was wrong, but lacked the humility and courage to fix it, that he spent his entire life fighting external enemies, while the real enemy was inside him all along, that he destroyed everyone who trusted him while telling himself he was fighting for their freedom. The complete story of Dutch van der Linde is ultimately about the danger of charismatic leadership divorced from accountability, about how intelligence without wisdom leads to catastrophe, about how narcissism corrupts even genuine ideals, about how people who talk most about loyalty are often the most willing to betray, about how the inability to admit mistakes turns setbacks into disasters, and about how some people are fundamentally unable to change, no matter how much evidence accumulates that their approach isn't working. Dutch's cautionary tale about trusting leaders who demand unquestioning loyalty, about following people who can't admit fault, about mistaking eloquence for wisdom and charisma for competence. His story resonates because versions of Dutch exist throughout history and in contemporary society, leaders in various domains who exhibit the same patterns of narcissism, manipulation, and destruction, while talking eloquently about higher purposes and noble goals. Understanding Dutch means understanding a dangerous personality type that recurs across contexts, making his story not just entertainment, but insight into human psychology and the dynamics of toxic leadership.